This is being recorded on June 20th, which is also a federal holiday, Juneteenth. I think many of you know that this is a holiday that very many African American families celebrated for some generations, but now we all get to take note of the holiday. And not just because it's a holiday, but in general, I want to do something slightly different today. Instead of sort of a single part of the world or topic, I want to roam around the world a little bit about the issues because so much of it is interconnected. And if one listens to individual news items, it's sometimes a little hard to see what the interconnection is and how one thing spills over into another. So in a sense, I'm going to survey things and call attention to things which overlap and one thing leads to another, etc. I hope that's okay with everybody. So let me start with what may seem like a silly comment. For those of you who have bird feeders and put feed out for wild birds, you either have already noticed or you might notice that the bird feed, which is many of us use, are sunflower seeds, and that they're either not available in the stores that you usually get your whatever 5, 10, 15-pound bag from. And when you can find some, the price has doubled or tripled. I think a 10-pound bag in some places now costs $50. So why is this? Well, because sunflower seeds that we import are largely produced in Ukraine, which is part of the disruption of agriculture and not just agriculture, but the shipping of grains, food products, and oil, sunflower seed oil very often, to the rest of the world. Now, it's a bird feed is a sort of a marginal and silly topic, but it's not so silly when you get to the fact that people don't have grains to eat, don't have oils with which to cook, and you're having a potential and looming major crisis in food in North Africa, in the Middle East, in some other places, because they get, as I mentioned in an earlier talk, a substantial amount of their grains from Ukraine Russia. This also that has to do with the war, right? But it spills over into economies and inconvenience for birdseed purchasers, etc. So even we feel it slightly. We also feel it slightly in the cost of bread and cereals and so forth, which are part of the food inflation. It has lots of reasons, but some portion of it also has to do with the war. It is also the case that the Ukrainian economy has been reduced by about 50%, which is very serious for the Ukrainians, even those that aren't in war zones. But the potential income coming from the existing grains, which can't get shipped out through the Black Sea, which is a normal shipping lanes, because there are both Russian boats and Ukrainian boats in the Black Sea, and it's full of landmines. So even if one wanted to break that loggerhead of ships that already have grain on them, for example, and or need to ship more grains out, what to do about the fact that the Black Sea, which after all is an international waterway, is can no longer be transversed. And that's even the case if Odessa does not get invaded by the Russians. One of the suggestions that has been made is that the Ukrainian ships that are in the Black Sea change their flags. Now, flags are how boats are registered, and that they re-register their boats with American flags and re-register boats as Americans, in which case, if the Russians do anything, they have to actually do harm to American ships rather than Ukrainian ships. And of course, if that happens, potentially we could get into the conflict in a way that we haven't done before. So you go kind of from bird seeds to food shortages, to potential famine, to potentially the U.S. gets drawn in, all because of the conflict in the Ukraine and the fact that it is the grain basket and the food oil basket for so much of the world. So one can see the interconnections there. To move to the larger issue of globalization, of course, which is part of this, you might have noticed that not just because of the war with Russia and access to oil and gas and all those issues, which I've talked about in the past, the globalization that we have enjoyed or benefited from it for the last decade and a half, even some people go back to the 90s, some people go back to 2020. That globalization, which was considered a virtue, right? We were all interdependent. And for two reasons, one having to do with the war in Ukraine and in that area, but also because of COVID, which also enters the picture. Much of the access to the products which are necessary for the American and other industrial economies were part of the general sort of globalization of production, meaning that, for example, in cars, it may have been an American automobile manufacturer, but the lithium for the batteries, the chips for all kinds of things in the cars and so forth, were sitting out there in container ships, or because of COVID, couldn't even be shipped out in certain times out of China. So manufacturing got held up. So we had, through not just the war, but all through to COVID, a kind of a perfect storm. On the one hand, we had lots of people at home, not much to do, ordering things on Amazon and everything imaginable. On the other hand, we had normal industries like the automobile industry, for example, also media companies and televisions and so forth, which were dependent on the interdependence of globalization of the means of production, right? And so we have seen recently, first of all, that you have inflation. Inflation is not entirely the consequence of this, but it's part of the picture. And the other thing is, many industries were brought to a halt and recognized that they were too dependent on components of their manufacturing, on the globalization of production. So you now have a new phenomenon, which, let me say, the way globalization worked, the word used was offshoring, right? You offshored a certain production where it was cheapest or best or whatever. Now you have a reversal, and now everybody's talking about onshoring, or in the political jargon of candidates, stopping importation, stopping trade with, let's say, China, stopping in the Trump years, laying on tariffs, which makes importation more expensive, and a general cry across the political spectrum, at least in the United States, on saying, well, we just need to be able to look after ourselves and not be dependent on all of this bits and pieces being produced somewhere else. Let me give you another example, clothing, right? If you go to Costco or even more upmarket shops, you can see that almost everything comes from some country in Asia or Latin America, because that's where it's produced. Because labor is cheaper, right? Once upon a time, it was Japan, then it became China, then China's wages became too high. Then increasingly, we saw in the clothing purchases, we saw labels from Vietnam, now increasingly Cambodia and Indonesia and so forth. So that also led to an expectation that this globalization produced, reliable and cheaper goods for our market. Now everybody is saying, yo, let us stop doing this. We need to produce our own clothing here domestically at home, and let's reshore some of these products. So it's largely technology, but I want to point out it's not only technology. Now, the role model from the perspective of the United States and some other countries in Europe of reshoring is to look at Telsa, the automobile manufacturer, because unlike General Motors and Ford and all of these companies, Tesla has essentially produced everything that goes into their cars, including control of some lithium mines overseas, right? So they don't need to import anything to produce their cars. And so now people are looking at that as a role model, saying, look, here's a role model of a company that has everything from ingredients to production that they can do in-house in the United States, and they don't need, all these overseas markets. So let's stop doing this. A more moderate take on the situation is to say, well, in any event, we shouldn't be manufacturing parts here and there for overseas. In Asia, let's concentrate on Mexico. That is a better area for us to share production. That all has its complexities. Has its complexities as well. But you see the consequence of this, that is to say reshoring and say, let's do it at home, means, of course, that the cost of production is higher. The cost of labor is higher. If you all of a sudden have American workers rather than, let's say, Cambodian workers or Chinese workers or Korean workers, for that matter, producing chips and other things. And that, of course, also fuels inflation, right? So the interface between years of advocating globalization and now, for largely political reasons rather than economic reasons, saying let's reshore it's in a sense moving away from a long period where both the politics and economics were in favor of globalization, and now all of a sudden we are moving into an area where saying, well, maybe globalization has gone out of hand. Now, let me give you one illustration going back to putting tariffs on and reducing increasing the cost of something comes in, and therefore maybe reducing the domestic purchases of it. Solar panels were a good case in point. Most solar panels are produced in China, right? And so what did the Trump administration do? They put tariffs on it. And that, of course, made solar panels more expensive, which means maybe you and some other people decided, oh, well, this is getting too expensive, even though you wanted to do it for climatological, environmental reasons. So the current administration has actually reduced the tariffs on solar panels so as to allow cheaper solar panels to come back in. That raises a very large question that tariffs in general are political acts. You want to punish a government, or you want to benefit your domestic industry, so you clap on tariffs, which reduces trade, or at least makes it more expensive. And that often also has the consequence, if you have to trade because you don't produce something, the consequence of also helping inflation and the cost of purchases. So you can see the interdependence here, right? You have the China bashing going on. You have concern about China. You have concern about not having access, perhaps for political reasons, access whether it's to oil or gas or manufactured products, either for political reasons or because the international trading system, container ships and so forth, are over taxed, and many of the ships, there are not only enough ships to ship the containers, but when the container ships arrive, for example, in the port of Los Angeles, and other places, they're sitting out there idle because the mechanisms for unloading them are taxed out, and they can't unload more ships either because there is no parking for the ships, and there's not even the labor necessarily to unload all these ships. So there are many, many sort of interlinking interrelationships, and when countries say to themselves, "Oh, we should do this ourselves. Let's produce everything in Ohio, having to do with cars and so forth." It is not easy. It is not cheap, and it undermines what used to be thought economically the best possible scenario of having globalization. And now globalization is being called into question because there have been hangups of one kind or another that are economic, as the one I just mentioned with container ships, but also because there are hostile relationships, right? How much do we want to really trade with China? What happens if there's conflict in East Asia? What happens if, for one reason or another, situations don't allow easy access or cheap access? In some cases, of course, it's maybe inconvenient. You can't get the car you had intended. You have to wait for 6 months. But in some cases, the situation is serious. For example, in the manufacture of drugs, right? There are many drugs that we take, doctor prescribed and otherwise, as well as vaccinations. The content is not produced has not been produced by and large in the United States, right? So if all of a sudden there are trade barriers for political reasons or economic reasons, the drugs that you used to get from India, from some part of Asia, and so forth, all of a sudden there's a shortage. And in point of fact, some of you might have noticed when you went to renew your prescription, something wasn't available right away, or the price had increased. And so then the question arises, do countries, the United States and other countries, have to examine the degree of their economic interdependence, both for political, economic, and also social and health reasons? And the latter process is currently going on, not just in the United States, but in other industrial countries. And the answer, by and large, in the US, where we have this sort of right-wing input which says we should produce everything ourselves. But in many countries, including partially in the United States, the answer is not to stop all importation or to completely reshore everything, but rather to make sure that in products that are necessary, for example, medication, you store supplies so that if for 3 months or 6 months, or maybe in certain instances even a year, you don't have access to something, at least you can continue to cope. So a lot of thought is being generated in many industrial countries and also in the United States, not just in what you want to manufacture by yourself, but things that continue to need to be imported or that you want to import. And what do you do about those? And should you not at least have stockpiles available in case of emergencies of one kind or another? So that is a major issue, and it's got very many moving parts, and I just wanted to introduce you to that. Then, of course, underlying all of this are climate change and environmental issues, which have an impact on the amount of food people can grow, and therefore the amount they need to import, which goes back to my first topic. There are all kinds of issues having to do with water, with production. There are political arguments about this. You might have noticed, and if you read the papers this morning or in the last few days, that the Republican Party is developing lawsuits that they are sending to the various levels of the judiciaries in states, some of which are heavily populated. The judiciary is heavily populated by Trump appointed judges, trying to nix or get rid of some of the environmental policies that the Environmental Protection Agency has generated and monitored for water safety, for forests and so forth, and essentially want the judges to rule that the Environmental Protection Agency, a federal agency, has no right to tell states and entities that what they may or may not do in these areas. And instead, legislation should be passed and nationally. That's sort of a joke, right? Because they pretty much know that our legislature is going to be in Republican hands, and therefore no environmental legislation will be passed. States like California are saying, well, we if the federal government will not provide us with legislation that makes environmental sense, we will pass legislation in the state of California. The Republican answer to that is that they will go back to court and argue that this is not a state right, it is a federal matter. And therefore, states are not entitled to have their own environmental policy. Now, none of this has happened yet, but you can see down the line the kinds of discussions and the kind of arguments we're having in the United States about all of this. So let me then take sort of this third bite at this, and that is the out and out politics. You might have noticed that there have been elections recently in Colombia, in South America, in Chile in South America, in France just now for the assembly. And we could throw in it's not an election, but the Republican convention in Texas that was just held, where essentially populists of the left and the right are winning elections. And that is a global phenomenon that is happening in many countries. Countries that were governed by centrists, with legislatures which, saw the gamut from left to right, but very often the majority were also centrists on the left and right, are being knocked off in every imaginable country, from industrial countries like France just now to countries in Latin America, in Africa, and so forth. Now, what is this all about? Why populists all of a sudden? And please note that populists tend to have fairly radical solutions, whether they're right on the left and the left, and also populists very often aren't terribly democratic in their outlook as to how you go about bringing changes. I think populations in almost all parts of the world feel alienated and feel that their governments are not functioning well in their behalf. In some countries, this is due to corruption, out and out corruption, true in some Latin American countries, African countries, even some European countries. In other countries, it's that dictators, even before you had corruption, have wormed their way to the top. For example, Orban in Hungary, in Egypt, Sisi in Egypt, other countries in Latin America, Africa, even in some East European countries, in Asia, and because they have reflected the alienation of the government, and therefore from the government, and therefore they have been elected. Very often centrists who then became dictators, true of Orban, true of some Central Americans. They seemed perfectly viable candidates in what they said, but after they came in office, they got rid of the judiciary or replaced it. They became more dictatorial. They passed all kinds of laws. So that has been going on for some years. And now, in addition to that, you have, as I said, populists of the left and the right. We speak for the people, and we're going to make changes. So in France, which after all is not some third world backwater, you have a situation where the assembly that was just voted for still has the centrist government, have sort of a huge chunk, but not the kind of chunk of representatives from the center, which will make it very easy for the head of the French government to implement some of the legislation that he had in mind. And on the left, you have a consolidation of an extreme left, which is socialist, even marginally communist, which wants to do all kinds of crazy things. But they have combined with Greens and the actual Communist Party in France and some other smaller leftist groups to get together united to have a left agenda which gets rid of Macron's agenda. And Macron, as you know, is a centrist, slightly to the right, and will be playing a bigger role in the government. On the right, you have Le Pen, who has been sort of a thorn in everybody's side for multiple elections. But for the assembly, she used to have maybe 10 seats or something. She just won 90 seats, which is remarkable and stunning. So I give you the French example to show that even in a Western democratic France, you have alienation of the population. Things are not going well, whether it's inflation, which is a big issue in some countries increasingly. In most countries, immigration, hostility to people who are not part of your culture. You want to keep them out. You think they're changing your culture. That is true all over Europe. That is true in the Middle East. For example, in Turkey right now, there's a big issue about that. That is true in Central America. That is true in Mexico, and that is very much true in the United States, right? So right-wing as well as left-wing supporters are saying to themselves, let's vote for people who are going to make big changes because these incremental reforms aren't working for us. Our societies are changing. Our economy is no good. There's instability of one kind or another in the United States. There's crime of one kind or another, shootings, school shootings. Other countries have other issues. There's anti-abortion, not just in the United States, but in Poland and other countries, so let's vote for people who are saying they're going to produce big changes. The fact of what these big changes portend may not at all have the results that people who are voting for them, but on the other hand, the voters are just angry. So you have angry voters. And of course, we have angry voters, right? The Republican convention in Texas a few days ago, they're still saying Trump has won and Biden is not a legitimate president. In other countries, they're saying what the government is doing is not legitimate. In Europe, you have the problem of access to oil and gas and energy. Everywhere there's hot spells, floods. People don't compute the relationship between these weather events and global climate change. And even if they think there's global climate change, they don't think their own societies need to do anything in a great big hurry, because that will tax them, make life more difficult, and so forth. So we have a perfect political and economic storm in the world. And what I've tried to talk about today is the fact that you can't just take one single country's policies, or the problem of inflation, or the problem of the Ukrainian war, or the problem of climate change. They are all getting mixed up. And in order to figure out how to move forward and produce something that has better economic, environmental, and political consequences, you actually have to look at a chessboard and move the chess pieces around in such a way that one undermines the bad things that are happening, and on the other hand, you move to some kind of reform And these reforms can't just be narrow reforms in one area, but have to be reforms which understand the linkages. And part of the linkages, of course, is that governments have to be able to talk about to their populations and somehow make plain what some of the linkages are. And governments are very bad at that. Macron is bad at that. Biden is not particularly good at that. Lots of governments are not particularly good at that. And that is invoking huge political instability in almost every part of the world. Now, the one umbrella part that I have not emphasized, which is also very much part of the dimension, is of course that COVID and the response to COVID has affected all of the things I have talked about. That is no government's fault, but the government's actions or inactions on this are interesting. Finally, I just want to say that because of what happened on January 6th, because of the hearings, because of the spillover of what is going on in the Republican Party, the unwillingness to do something serious in the United States about guns, the unwillingness to do in the United States often to do anything serious about the environment, and what appears to be a democracy at risk in the United States also undermines the US position in the world. Yes, we are the strongest military power. Yes, the Biden administration has, gone back to alliances and so forth. But the harm that has been done for US policy by the Trump administration, you can see, for example, that the harm is impacting making any kind of agreement right now with Iran and the Middle East, and I'll get back to that. But we are no longer perceived as a role model. People can see our serious flaws. And I don't mean going back to Juneteenth, that just the flaws of slavery, but the flaws of our human rights violations in Abu Ghraib, in Guantanamo, the suffering of people. We're the only industrial country in the world that does not have something like universal health care, which would have kept a lot of people alive. We need to realize that per capita, the US did the worst job in keeping people alive under COVID of any industrial country. So whether it's health, whether it's violence, whether it's challenges to democracy, we look like a very tarnished country in the world. And that means if we want to continue or hope to regain our footing as a role model for anybody, it's, of course, we need to clean up our own act. But it also means that during these trying times, where everything is unstable in the world, economically, politically, socially, the one country that might have been expected to help and foster getting things back on track slowly was the United States, and we are no longer able to play that role, which is very sad for all of us. So on that negative note, let me end and see you in, I think, a couple of weeks.